But all the ladies in my family are like that. Her youngest daughter, Evelyn, who was born in 1962, had said some words but had never put a sentence together. And we were listening to her first sentence, and we had company, and she said to the company, "Go out and sit on the floor." And that didn't, we listened more carefully. She was saying, "Goldwater in 64. Oh, man. But I must say that my entire South Carolina family is very suspicious of me becoming involved in politics and moving north to Washington. And when they heard I was moving even further north to Bryn Mawr, they were inconsolable. The most I could do was to try to mollify them, was to tell them that whereas General Lee had only gotten as far as Gettysburg, that I had reached the very outer works of Philadelphia. It is my very great privilege to have been closely associated with ISI for 27 years, since, as Chris pointed out, my freshman year at Washington and Lee University, when Jeff Gaynor thrust a copy of The Conservative Mind into my hands. But there are many in this room whose ISI connections go back much further, and some who were present at the creation in 1952. It was actually incorporated in 1953. In fact, of the 24 families who were financially responsible for launching ISI in the 50s, 10 of them are represented in this room tonight. And the rest of them, almost all of the rest of them, are still with us with support like that. No wonder we've been around 40 years. Louise Oliver will have more to say about this in a moment. We're also very fortunate to have a good number of ISI's trustees present, whom I'd like to recognize at this time. ISI's President Emeritus, and hold applause please till the end, and I'll ask him to stand. ISI's President Emeritus, Vic Milioni. ISI's Chairman, Louise Oliver. ISI's Vice Chairman, Richard Larry. Former Chairman, Ed Fulner. Longtime Secretary Treasurer, Charles Hoflick. Richard V. Allen, who was having a contest during the cocktail hour to determine just who had been an ISI member the longest. He's been a member for 39 years. Stan Evans, I think, comes in at 40. Lee Edwards is at 40. Can anybody at 40 besides Charles Hoflick? Of course, but we'll hear that later. Anyone else? Buckley, of course. Okay. But you all will be introduced later. All right. Bill Campbell is here, our trustee. George Carey, Congressman Phil Crane, Jim Evans, Stan Evans, Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk has just celebrated at a big conference in the regional meeting of the Philadelphia Society 40 years of the conservative mind, 40th anniversary, and in 5 days we'll celebrate his 75th birthday. Bob Kriebel, William Regnery, Wayne Vallis, James Burnley, Bob Miller, all of these ISI trustees are with us. Would you please stand? Let me also introduce those seated at the head table who will not be introduced later. At my left, Mrs. E. Victor Milioni. Mrs. Dinesh D'Souza. Whose given name is Dixie. I mean, they're trying to get a whole multicultural experience going in the same household. Mrs. Edwin J. Fulner. I want to especially recognize members of the ISI staff are here. Their talent and dedication make up for the long hours and Spartan conditions. They're listed in your program, so I won't introduce them individually, but I'd like for them to stand, and I'd like also all former staff members to also stand, please. That may be a plurality of the guests. One of our programs, one of many programs, is a fellowship program for people who will become college professors. We pay for a year of their PhD studies if they intend to stick the course for 30 or 40 years afterwards. Of those 400 fellows, 15 or so are with us tonight. With all the ISI Richard M. Weaver Fellows, please stand. You see a member of the head table stood up who obviously is not a teacher, but he slipped through the net, but we're glad to have him too. Finally, I'd like to welcome some current members of ISI. We couldn't celebrate our 40th without a representation of our main constituents, including the academics who've been so close to us, but also the students. Several schools were especially invited to be with us. As I read the name of the university, please stand. Duke University, Yale University, stand please, there we go. Princeton, Christendom College, Catholic University, St. Norbert's College, Washington and Lee University. Those are the flesh and blood examples of ISI's impact. For over the years, ISI has devoted 100% of its resources to recruit the best of the new generation and equip them with all that's necessary for them to become stewards of Western culture, a culture that finds noble expression in the founding consensus of our own nation. As usual, Ronald Reagan put it best, and I quote, "Those of us in politics necessarily deal with present difficulties, and it is reassuring to us that ISI has its eye on the next generation, remembering Harold Macmillan's warning that history will deal harshly with those who abandon tomorrow in favor of today. Because ISI and the intellectual conservatism it represents refused to abandon tomorrow back in 1953, political conservatism has been muscular in power, it is muscular in opposition, and will flex those muscles when it returns to power." It's my pleasure to introduce for a special presentation the recently elected chairman of ISI's Board of Trustees, who presided at her first board meeting this morning. Louise Vitor Oliver was born and raised in New Haven, where her father was the curator of maps at Yale University. She majored in economics at Smith, from which she graduated with distinction. She's a member of Phi Beta Kappa. She was associate editor at National Review, was director of the surrogate speakers for Jim Buckley's senatorial campaign in '76. In 1980, Louise, her husband Dan, and her 5 children moved to Washington. There she worked as assistant to the director of Target 80's program, a woman's talent bank at the Republican National Committee. She also helped found Learn Incorporated. In January '84, she became director of secretarial boards and commissions in the Office of Presidential Personnel at the White House, a very significant job for peopling the 6,000 Reagan appointees with people who would further his agenda. In September of '88, Louise joined the Office of Educational Research and Improvement at the United States Department of Education, where she worked as a special assistant and consultant for the next 4 years. In '89, President Reagan appointed Mrs. Oliver commissioner of the National Commission on Children. If that was '89, it must have been a deathbed appointment, but he made a lot of those. Those are the arid facts of the curriculum vitae. She's known to us with her activity in conservative circles, especially in conservative philanthropic circles, including her work with the Philanthropic Roundtable. She's a new member of the board of the Donner Foundation. But that really doesn't tell us who Louise is. Those of us who are fortunate enough to count her as friend and ally know her as an elemental force for the preservation of the permanent things that conservatism cherishes. And for purposes of recognizing ISI's founding family and to make a surprise presentation, please welcome Louise Oliver.
Thank you, Ken. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Despite my current exalted position in this august organization, I have been instructed to be short, but I think I will leave being short to Ken Cribb. It is my happy responsibility this evening, as chairman of ISI, to express our collective gratitude for the wisdom and generosity of the founders of ISI, notwithstanding our collective suspicion of any endeavor described as collective, and especially remembering that ISI's original name was the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. ISI was founded 40 years ago by a small group of far-sighted individuals who believed that the nurturing of a free society should not be left to chance. They knew the endurance of a free society requires work as well as grace, and it requires vision, a skill often rejected in the highest levels of government and in some of the biggest and bluest corporate boardrooms. A free society cannot survive unless each generation hands down to the next a love of the permanent things, as well as of an occasional almost permanent thing like the friendship of Russell Kirk. That was ISI's assignment, to care for students in their college years. Those are perilous years. Several decades ago, a series of National Review surveys of college students conclusively proved that students enter college as conservatives but emerge as liberals. They are educated for the state by statists. And so it should not surprise us that whenever there is no one on their campus standing athwart history yelling, "Stop," the trend will be always towards bigger state and less liberty. ISI's founders recognized the problem and, in the manner de Tocqueville described a couple of centuries ago, set about solving it by forming an organization which we know today as the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. They had vision and they had courage. Today's generation may celebrate the conscience of a conservative, both the book and the moral force. But these days, after one of our own conservatives spent 8 years in the White House as the world's most powerful man, it is easy to forget the courage of those early conservatives, the courage it took to be an outspoken critic of big government, an advocate of the permanent things. We at ISI and of ISI tend by the nature of our work to be mindful of vision and courage. But we must not be unmindful nor ungrateful for the third ingredient necessary to the founding of this organization: money. We may consider money to be a most impermanent thing, but as ISI's first president reminded us years ago, while we cannot live by bread alone, we cannot live without it. Let us, therefore, at this celebration of ISI's 40 years, express our gratitude to those courageous conservatives who were financially responsible for launching ISI. In your dinner program, you will find listed on page 3 the name of 24 families who helped make ISI's work possible during its first years. We should also remember, now and in our prayers tonight, those who have been translated to a better world. ISI's first contributor, J. Howard Pugh, and other members of his family, including John G. Pugh, Jr., an ISI founding trustee and chairman, Harry Bradley, William Brady, an ISI trustee, Albert Campbell, an ISI trustee, Jasper Crane, Rogers Follansby, Pierre Goodrich, Jacqueline Hume, Jeremiah Milbank, William Regnery, Beverly Thompson, and Edwin Wiegand. For their vision, courage, and generosity, we are grateful. We are also delighted that 3 of the actual founders of ISI are with us tonight: Richard Scaife, Charles Hoflich, one of ISI's original trustees and former chairman of the board, and Phil Crane, also an ISI trustee. In addition, we have representatives from 8 more of ISI's founding families: Michael Joyce, representing the Bradley family, our own trustee, Bill Campbell, and his wife, Helen, of the Albert Campbell family, David Kennedy of the Earhart family, Frank Fahrenkopf, representing the Edwin Wiegand family, Bill Regnery and Mrs. Alfred Regnery, Christina, representing the Regnery family, Nancy Follansby Campaign and Anthony Campaign and Rogers Follansby, representing the Follansby family, Wid Washburn, representing the William H. Donner family, and Bill Dennis, representing the Goodrich family and the Liberty Fund. Would the ISI founders and their representatives please stand? On behalf of ISI, its board and its staff, and the thousands of students and teachers ISI has served for years and continues to serve, we salute you and your families. You and your families have been ISI's founding fathers. Without your vision, your courage, and your generosity, ISI could not have spent the last 40 years strengthening the legacies of our nation's founding fathers. Your shoulders were broad and your pockets were deep. Generations of students have learned about liberty because of you. For your service, we are truly grateful. Thank you. And now I want to say a few words about a later leader of ISI, a man we all know and prize, who became chairman of ISI in 1989, Ed Feulner. Ed's vision and leadership, combined of course with the now legendary executive expertise of Ken Cribb, greatly increased ISI's reach. Standing on those broad shoulders of ISI's founders, Ed saw how ISI could grow in the post-Reagan years, and grow it has. ISI now has over 2,600 student and faculty volunteer representatives providing a wide range of educational programs and publications to over 1,000 colleges and universities. In 1989, ISI was a presence in only 496 of these. More than 37,000 students and faculty members have joined ISI over the last 4 years, bringing the total to 52,000 ISI members today. Over the past 4 years, ISI's annual on-campus educational programs, lectures, conferences, and summer schools have grown from 166 to 347. The print run of ISI's publications has increased from 100,000 to 560,000 copies. The growth in the number of ISI's people and publications has been remarkable. But the bread has risen too. And without that bread, the financial support of people in this room and of hundreds of other individuals, foundations, and corporations, ISI's growth would not have been possible. Under Ed's leadership, those generous people who shared the vision of ISI's founders made possible ISI's truly remarkable progress. Since 1989, ISI annual revenue has grown from $900,000 to over $2.6 million. This year's budget is over $3 million. And all of this has been accomplished without in any way changing ISI's original mission of passing the principles and values of a free society on to successive generations. Clearly, ISI is now a major success story, and it is fitting that on the same night we honor ISI's founders for their vision, courage, and generosity, we recognize the vision, energy, and persistence of Ed Feulner, who did so much to make ISI's recent success possible. Ed, would you come up here for a minute?
Dirty trick.
And this is a token of appreciation for all you have done for ISI. Of course, in my role as chairman of an organization whose purpose is to midwife the truth to our nation's students, I would be remiss if I did not concede that there are a few souls who do not like our own optically challenged, temporarily abled Ed Feulner. Perhaps that's because Ed is not biocentric. He believes that not all species are equal. For example, Ed believes that man does not have to share this planet with the smallpox virus. Partly, it's because Ed has a library filled with desiccated processed tree carcasses written primarily by non-viable, melanin-impoverished European males. Partly it's because Ed is not a compulsive buyer of cruelty-free products. Partly those people who don't like Ed It's because of policy review, the Heritage Foundation Journal has been critical of the voluntarily leisured as well as the voluntarily undomiciled. You and I may think such people are simply of differing sobriety or alternatively emotioned and count for little. But they exist in large numbers and inhabit primarily the water buffalo preserves. And we send you forth to continue doing battle, armed with this symbol of leadership and power, which we hope will remind you in the years to come of our gratitude for all your service to ISI.
Fantastic. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Ken.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For our second and final surprise presentation of the evening, I'd like to ask Vic Milioni to join me at the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here this evening celebrating ISI's 40 years of educating for liberty, primarily because of the tenacious commitment to truth of one man, ISI's President Emeritus, Vic Milioni. It's been my distinct honor to follow in his footsteps. It was easy, really. He laid a firm foundation. It was also easy because, as you can see, we wear about the same shoe size.
Right.
In fact, Vic is one of the only men I have looked up to whom I did not also have to look up at. Vic shared with ISI's founder, Frank Chodoroff, the insight that the left sought to effect the long-term transformation of the American character by dominating the institutions charged with educating the young. American students were being treated as cannon fodder, really, in an ideological war against the foundations of our culture that rages in the academy to this day. For most of the past 40 years, Vic commanded resources inconsequential compared to the left-wing academic establishment, but he never flagged. He always had in mind, and would frequently quote Tocqueville's observation, that every fresh generation is a new people. Vic knew that whatever the ravages of the moment, a life worth living could be restored by properly influencing the best of the rising generation. But how to transform that insight into a living, breathing institution that could reach significant numbers over significant periods of time? Well, for one thing, Vic was convinced that the early conservative movement's concentration on economic education had to be broadened to all humane studies. From such breadth, worldviews are formed which can either affirm or sweep away arguments of economic efficiency. For another, Vic saw that for every means of doing damage commanded by the academy, ISI must have a constructive alternative for the student discerning enough to know that he was missing something. If ISI was denied schools, it could have summer schools. If the classroom was out of reach, there was the independent lecture and the seminar. If ISI couldn't assign the text, it could make available alternative libraries of books and journals through the mails. In short, Vic brought to ISI an insistence on intellectual breadth and variety so that any essential need of the rising young scholar could be met. And to accomplish that, Vic has taken infinite pains, spanning 35 years. And while others, Frank Chodoroff, Bill Buckley, must be credited with ISI's conceptualization, Vic must be credited with its very existence. In the course of making an institution, Vic has not as yet produced lengthy tomes of theory. He has nevertheless transmitted, through his beloved ISI, to literally millions of young people, the constituent elements of a free and virtuous society. And in so doing, he has written upon eternity and is due our undying gratitude.
This is a Lifetime Achievement Award. I'll finish.
Dick has just accepted ISI's first Lifetime Achievement Award, which will henceforth be given annually in his name. Now, to celebrate this milestone in the advent of modern American conservatism, we are gathered as members of a highly articulated movement that has become a fixture in the intellectual and political life of our nation. And it is very easy to forget that in the late 1940s, the left totally dominated the discourse of ideas in America. True, Richard Weaver, Friedrich Hayek, and others were beginning to be read. True, there was a gaggle of conservative spokesmen, defenders of business interests, assorted Republicans, just about as distinguished as their more recent counterparts. Ex-communists who had come to their senses, Southerners who mourned their vanished life, and serious commentators who warned of the growing threat of the modern state. But these interests tended to pull away from each other rather than to find common ground. As Churchill once complained to his hostess at dinner, "Madam, this pudding has no theme." Then three things occurred between 1953 and 1955 that helped American conservatism find its center of gravity. First, with the publication of Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, the post-World War II recrudescence of conservative thought became self-conscious and overt. Second, with the advent of ISI, with Bill Buckley as its first president, a market was generated for conservative scholarship, which also provided an institutional link to its potential audience. And third was, of course, the establishment of National Review. And by the way, its longtime publisher, William Rusher, traveled 3,000 miles to be here with us tonight. Bill Buckley's National Review is justly celebrated for its role as midwife to a movement that has achieved successes unimaginable in 1955. Bill's role as polemicist and popularizer is legendary. But even more important was the decisive role of Buckley and his little magazine in crafting an intellectual consensus which accommodated the warring proponents of freedom on the one hand and the proponents of order on the other. These claims could be reconciled, said Buckley, Frank Meyer, and the National Review Fusionists, by limiting the authority of the state vis-à-vis individual freedom, while also acknowledging that virtue is the proper object of that freedom, virtue that finds its expression through the principal traditions of Western civilization. Thus, freedom remains indispensable, but as a means to ends of a moral character. Put another way, Ronald Reagan's famed electoral coalition was made possible by an antecedent intellectual coalition forged by William F. Buckley, Jr. But of course, one cannot really separate Buckley, the shaping conservative intelligence, from Buckley, the polemicist. These strands twine together in the man, and as polemicist, he is liable to pop up anywhere. I remember flipping the channels in the late 60s to glimpse that familiar visage in, of all places, on Laugh-In. "Mr. Buckley," he was asked, "I noticed that on your own program, Firing Line, you're always sitting down. Is this because you can't think on your feet?" Said Buckley, "It is hard to stand up under the weight of all that I know." And after the laughter subsides, there persists the faint trace of self-mockery of his own image as Renaissance man, an image that Toastmasters reinforce from coast to coast with knowing references to the harpsichord, the mayoral race, to the spy novels. But listen to Buckley himself in a 1986 speech define the Renaissance man. Quote, "He is not the man who with aplomb can fault the béarnaise sauce at Maxime's before attending a concert at which he detects a musical solecism, returning to write an imperishable sonnet before preparing a lecture on civics that the next day will enthrall an auditorium." No, the Renaissance man is, I think, someone who bows his head before the great unthreatened truths, and while admitting and even encouraging all advances in science, nevertheless knows enough to know that the computer does not now exist, nor ever shall, that has the power to repeal the basic formulas of civilization. End quote. It is in service to those basic formulas of civilization, in service to the unseen things that do not die, that Bill Buckley has striven mightily and well these 40 years and more. Please welcome ISI's first president, William F. Buckley, Jr., on the topic, the conservative intellectual revival.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Kenneth. We have made strides in Frank Todorow's 50-year plan to disassemble the planted axioms of socialism, and the work of this organization is greatly responsible for the progress made, not by fighting from the trenches, which isn't what the ISI does, but by indicating to those who are in the trenches in which direction to fire. Phil Twain has occupied one of those trenches for a long time, and he arrived in Washington already knowing where the enemy was, but no matter how much we know about him, intuitively and through study, what is the enemy and what are his resources and his stratagems? We never know quite enough, in part because the enemy is always moving and changing its disguises and fashioning new narcotics, so that we need to familiarize ourselves with his guile. Ed Meese has been in the trenches and discovered there that there were as many people firing at him as he had colleagues firing at them. There is never in a world in which God ordained that even his own existence should be a problematic. An excess of ammunition, an excess of popularly accepted certitudes, these need constantly to be revived, deepened, fed by experience. It is the task of ISI to do this, along with its brothers and sisters, I had better say, before Dinesh D'Souza denounces me for political incorrectness. How very proud Frank Todorov must be of the organization he founded, which Victor Milione, to whom appropriate tribute has been paid, guided for so many years, and now exudes strength under Kenneth Cribb, to whom I am, for obvious reasons, personally grateful. We wonder about the continuing enterprise. The conservative revival, of course, is something that already happened, and probably its most illustrious godfather is Russell Kirk. But even Russell cannot bring out a new edition of his masterpiece every year, and the perspectives change, even if only slightly, every year. We are speaking about a phenomenon that tends to alter in shape. Sometimes it is more reassuring to accept from survivors of a lost cause, indeed even from honorable deserters, an account of what happened, so to speak visually, what happened most concretely within the borders of the Iron Curtain in the years since our last anniversary celebration. We had working for us multifarious pressures. They ranged in Russia and Eastern Europe, from an asphyxiated market that engendered economic scarcity to the dramatization of a day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, to prayers spoken every Sunday throughout the Christian world for the liberation of the enslaved peoples. Soviet communism was shattered, and I say again that witnesses to the meaning of what happened are especially valuable if they come from the socialist camp. Professor Eugene Genovese, a socialist who was once beguiled by communism, wrote last year that, quote, surely the 80s will be remembered as the decade in which socialism met its Waterloo. No account of blather about the collapse of communism's having opened the way to real and democratic socialism will serve. Many things went into the making of the collapse of the communist regimes, but as every one-time communist from Gorbachev on admits, the immediate cause has been exposed as state ownership of the means of production, and for reasons that, alas, Ludwig von Mises, among other right-wingers, long ago identified. This is ideological street talk, blunt, confessional, and Eugene Genovese doesn't stop. He goes on, it is easy to forget that the entire project of the socialist reconstruction of society proceeds on the bold Marxist assertion of the superiority of socialism as an economic system, yet nothing could be more naive than the radical left daydream that the economy would fare better in the wake of the destruction of all hierarchy and stratification and the transfer of economic power to the workplace everywhere and always when such nostrums have been tried. The result has been a catastrophic erosion of the work ethic and a retreat into the modern equivalents of peasant self-sufficiency and attendant economic devolution. So Mr. Genovese says, many things contributed to the collapse of Soviet communism, to which list we should also add a nuclear deterrent. But was the conservative intellectual revival one of these? Let's hear on that point from another socialist, Robert Heilbroner, writing in dissent. Capitalism has been as unmistakably a success as socialism has been a failure. Here is the part that's hard to swallow. It has been the Friedmans, Hayeks, von Mises who have maintained that capitalism would flourish and that socialism would develop incurable ailments. All three have regarded capitalism as the natural system of free men. All have maintained that left to its own devices, capitalism would achieve material growth more successfully than any other system. From this admittedly impressionistic and incomplete sampling, I draw the following discomforting generalizations. The further to the right one looks, the more prescient has been the historical foresight. The further to the left, the less so. Professor Heilbroner tells us that the patron economic saints of the ISI, Mises, Hayek, Friedman, correctly analyzed the weaknesses and the tendencies of socialism. He does not, in fact, tell us that these analyses brought socialism down. A correct analysis of the motives for crime doesn't end criminal behavior. But any intellectual revival begins by seizing the distinction, which is here that an individual can commit crime, but an individual cannot commit socialism. Socialism, however, is indeed committed in a democratic system by aggregations of individuals, and it must be a high aspiration of any conservative intellectual revival to learn how to keep pace with the changing forms of socialism. Before the period designated by Genovese and Heilbroner, we needed to argue mostly a priori. Hayek spoke about the road to serfdom. Conservative analysts can argue a posteriori, describing the road from serfdom. But to do this, one needs to describe what serfdom is. And to do this, one needs to know what serfdom is and how far in that direction we have traveled on this matter. I have two observations to contribute. The first, that too much of the literature that is issued under the frank of libertarianism is not very useful and not at all compelling. When, as president of the John Randolph Club, Murray Rothbard calls for abolishing the Constitution and going back to the Articles of Confederation, the relapse is into baby talk utopianism, or for that matter, anti-utopianism. Albert J. Nock could write an intoxicatingly lyrical paean to the joys of anarchy, but sobriety eventually returns, and tells us, among other things, that Mr. Nock and, yes, Mr. Mencken and, yes, Frank Chardoff would have lived very miserable lives in an anarchic state for so simple a reason as that everyone lives miserable lives under anarchy, and this is the reason why anarchies never last very long. Those who suffer under it will always prefer an alternative, even if it is a dictatorship. But the orthodox libertarians are useful in reminding us of the perils of forgetting about the unnecessary inroads of the state. When Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, I counseled in National Review that the job of the conservative was always to burnish the paradigms, to remind ourselves of what could be, of what would be preferable, for instance, to the current Social Security programs or to socialized schooling. But then in dealing with the current political scene, to applaud or rebuke President Reagan with some sense of what it was politically possible for him to do at that moment in history. An intellectual revival requires us to distinguish between the normative and the doable. The danger is, on the other hand, very real, that by coexistence with statist forms, we grow to accept them, cease ever to remonstrate against them, even as the polls recently voted to bring back something a little closer to the old order. Alfred North Whitehead reminded us that we learn much more about distant cultures by examining what it is that they didn't talk about than by what it is that they did talk about. What societies don't talk about, they take for granted, even as the British, for instance, took for granted the specifications of a Shakespearean stage, so that when in the 19th century scholars sought to recreate such a stage, they found its dimensions nowhere specified, except finally in the archives of Philip II in Escorial. His ambassador did not take for granted the shape of an Elizabethan stage, and therefore thought to describe it exactly for the benefit of his sovereign. The New Republic tweaks us this week by telling us that if the National Health Program, introduced last week by Senator Phil Gramm on behalf of the right wing of the Republican Party, had been proposed by him as recently as 18 months ago, we'd have run him out of town as a neo-socialist. There is some truth in this. We tend to accept the accretions of time, the centralization of the state, the attrition of our liberties. Can these be indexed? It is, of course, not possible exactly to quantify freedom. That freedom which is most exuberantly protected these days is the freedom of speech. It is a most precious freedom, but not, in fact, one universally exercised. If there is a rough correlation between those who do not bother to vote and those who do not bother to speak their minds, then about half of America doesn't bother to exercise a freedom that is sanctified because the epistemological burden of democracy rests on its shoulders. If we do not speak about our contents and our discontents, how do we relay our wishes to our ministers? So we agree that such exercises are difficult, that it is not easy to measure intangibles. Even so, I would suggest that an intellectual revival might accept the challenge of devising a plausible means of identifying lost liberties. In order to do this satisfactorily, it is first necessary to discover, or rather to certify, property as a civil right. Having done this, we could go on to make, if not an exact measure, a plausible measure of the rights we continue to exercise by measuring the percentage of the community's business being done by the public sector, i.e. removed from ad hoc individual choice. Intuitively, we know that at the two extremes we would be without liberty. Without any government to exercise those functions Adam Smith acknowledged here in public order, we would have anarchy, quickly followed by despotism. And if the public sector were to spend 100% of the earnings of the people, we would qualify as slaves. The libertarian impulse is to move as far as we can in one direction. The impulse of the conservatives is to restrain that libertarian drive this side of civil disorder. I have privately diverted myself for almost 10 years with an insight which I first put down as merely cranky and ahistorical, but which by stages has tantalized and finally seduced me. It is this, that although a constitutional amendment is the supreme law of the land, constitutional amendments cannot contradict one another, for the same reason that God cannot decree that 2 and 2 make 5. Sidney Hook pointed up what he called the paradoxes of freedom. You have a right to keep silent. I have the right to compel your witness. You have the right to speak. I have the right to hold you accountable for slander. But these, like the eternal fight attempting to define at once the freedom to practice religion and the guarantee against its establishment, are in the nature of accommodations. But the 14th Amendment guarantees us the equal protection of the laws, while the 16th Amendment permits the taxation of income, which authority was instantly interpreted as legislative authority to tax unequally, i.e. to give unequal protection under the laws. I retailed this insight here tonight for the first time, and perhaps it will be completely ignored, but then again, perhaps it will take heuristic root in the minds of the scholars associated with this lively and vital organization. The first meeting of its board of directors was held in my garage study at Stamford, Connecticut in 1953. The responsibility for its nurture and growth is entirely that of others, because the venerable Frank soon left us, and my role has been simply that of an acolyte, a consumer and an admirer whose enthusiasm for your work is a matter of record. For all that we acknowledge the unimaginable, we can still pine for it. Stan Evans taught us years ago that any country that can put a man on the moon can repeal the income tax. And Ken Cribb, with his captivating animation and fine inquisitive mind, has given us reason on this 40th anniversary to be confident that the future of ISI is in good hands. What more can one ask for than an organization with such trustees and advisors as Ed Fullner and Charles Hoflick, and Dick Scaife and Dick Allen operating under the whiplash of Board Chairman Louise Oliver. Such an organization cannot stray, can't decompose, can only grow strong, even as the government under the shattering force of ISI's irradiation grows weaker. Good night and congratulations.
Bill, thank you so much.
Well, Bill Buckley has had a 4-decade relationship with ISI. Our next speaker is one of the newest but most popular personalities associated with the Institute. Dinesh has much in common with our previous speaker. The young Bill Buckley made his early mark by writing controversial editorials for the Yale Daily News. Dinesh made his early mark with his colorful commentary and controversial association with the Dartmouth Review. Buckley realized his promise by coming out with God and Man at Yale shortly thereafter. Dinesh followed with Illiberal Education, an enormously influential and critically acclaimed study of the overwhelming leftist dominance of our university. Both had early associations with important magazines. Both aroused bitter antagonism and became the principal targets of their respective generations' orthodox liberals. ISI is honored to have Dinesh D'Souza this year as its Salvatore Distinguished Scholar. He will be outlining for thousands of young people the principles that animate our Western institutions and undergird our constitutional republic, while at the same time countering the sterile platitudes of politically correct teachers and administrators. I'm pleased to introduce to you one of the most articulate voices of his own generation, Dinesh D'Souza, to speak to us about the present discontents in the Academy.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. I'm particularly pleased to see the young people in the room. They put me in mind of my own infamous undergraduate experience at the Dartmouth Review, where I remember we used to tell the deans that taking on our undergraduate newspaper was a bit like wrestling with a pig. Not only does it get everyone dirty, but the pig likes it. I was very happy to see Mr. Salvatore, a great benefactor of ISI out in California a few months ago, and he said to me that the single remedy for the afflictions of the American Academy, both at the school and the college level, was to place in the hands of every student a copy of the Declaration of Independence and a copy of the Constitution. I told him that this was deeply shocking advice, considering the fact that these documents were authored by white males, and moreover, there was circumstantial evidence that these men were heterosexual. He looked very puzzled at this reaction. He has apparently not set foot on a college campus in many years. There is an interesting debate that has erupted on college campuses. We hear a great deal about the unholy trinity of race and gender and sexual orientation and so on. I think that the issue of race is to some degree unique. It affords possibilities of social balkanization that one does not have in other areas. The politics of gender is no doubt very problematic, and yet I am somewhat reassured by something that Gerald Ford, of all people, once said. He said that there will never be a war between the sexes because there is simply too much fraternizing with the enemy. I do think that the politics of sexual orientation is also very interesting, and no doubt there are people struggling with problems and questions of identity. I suppose personally I'm most troubled about the rather determined enterprise to place in the hands of every elementary school student a contraceptive. I suppose that my skepticism toward this project is best summarized by the classical expression, beware of Greeks bearing Trojans. The debate on American campuses, particularly from the point of view of young people, I think is a study in contradictions. Because young people come to school having been born many years after the Civil Rights Movement and really taking for granted Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For most young people today, it is really unimaginable to put someone in the back of the bus or to set up a separate drinking fountain. These ideas are simply beyond the pale. And yet these young people open their college catalogs and it says on the very front page, the University of Michigan does not discriminate on the basis of race or national origin and so on, and ethnicity and so on. And yet young people realize troublingly that this assertion is belied by their own experience, and they know from their own experience that racial preferences have unfortunately become very much embedded in the fabric of campus life, both at the level of undergraduate admissions and at the level of faculty hiring. And if you thumb through any university catalog, you will undoubtedly be struck by Elysian pictures of students of different races and backgrounds sitting under beautiful babbling brooks and palm trees, reading wonderful, great works. Once again, I think young people are perplexed that this vision, this harmonious, interracial and multi-racial vision is really belied by their own college experience, an experience characterized by separate ethnic dormitories, separate proms, separate facilities, separate organizations, ethnic-based sororities, fraternities, and so on. I think that there are a few elements of good news in this bleak scenario. One of them is that I think we have largely won the battle over speech codes. Not only has there been a Supreme Court decision on this point, but colleges have really stopped trying to legislate and implement new codes. And those colleges that do have codes have been, in a sense, trying to rework them, perhaps to moderate or even get rid of them altogether. I think perhaps the achievement of the criticism of political correctness in which ISI has played an important role has been to take an agenda that has been largely uncontroversial and to make it a matter of argument, of debate, of criticism, by no means a settled issue, so that many of these sacred cows that have been grazing unmolested for so long must now put up with some careful examination and even scrutiny. The real problem, I think, on our campuses is not a problem of choosing between Western and non-Western culture. In fact, it's not even a debate about the end of Western civilization. Some of you know that a question to this effect was recently put to my countryman Gandhi, who was once asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he replied, "I think it would be a good idea." The problem, I would say, is a problem of ignorance. Our young people are unfamiliar very often with the basic ingredients of both Western and non-Western civilization. Alan Bloom put it very well some years ago. They are aliens in their own culture. They do not know American history. They do not know American literature. And that is the essential prerequisite for opening one's doors and windows to the outside world. One of the problems with trying to reestablish any kind of a sensible liberal arts curriculum, even a multicultural curriculum, is the vehement criticism that any such curriculum will be necessarily and intrinsically biased in favor of white males and, as is often added, dead white males. Is this criticism in any way true? Is there any grain of truth to it? We could briefly consider the example of William Shakespeare, who was conceitedly a white male. But of course, so were a lot of other poets who composed in Elizabethan England, which raises the interesting question of why is Shakespeare so great? Why do young people read him and not someone else? Could it be because a small cabal of white males got together and said, well, he's whiter than any of us, or more masculine, an impression belied by the illustrations? My point is that obviously Shakespeare's appeal has a great deal to do with his sonnets and plays, which are thought to embody a range of wisdom or insight that makes them surpass that of other, perhaps lesser works. My concern is that we are gradually moving in our schools and universities toward something I sometimes call a weird cultural Olympics, in which every group is now approaching the reading list only interested in one question, and that is, what did my guys do? Now, if you think about it, this is a very strange question because of its underlying philosophical assumption which is that books and ideas and knowledge and cultures and whole civilizations that existed hundreds or thousands of years ago, these have suddenly become, in a sense, the ethnic property of small groups of people who happen to be walking about. It is almost as though young white males get up in the morning and have a big smile on their face when they look in the mirror because, you know, Homer wrote the Iliad. I mean, you have this rather peculiar notion of knowledge and of ideas as constituting some sort of a racial or ethnic patent. This is obviously antithetical to what education should be all about, which of course is not to freeze us into these narrow categories, but to help emancipate us from these categories, these provincialisms of race, class, gender, nationality, and so on, so we can make empathetic leaps across cultural boundaries, so we can put ourselves in the place of others who are not like us, so we can search for that elusive universal point of view that allows us to be critical of other cultures and of our own, of the past as well as of the present. My first exposure to ISI came many years ago when I was an undergraduate in college. I submitted and was happy to have published in the Intercollegiate Studies Review one of my own sophomoric tomes, which I recall was an essay on the French Revolution, and if I remember correctly, I was against it. ISI has come a long way since then and has made a very powerful impact. It has multiplied its strength. It has gotten involved in the PC wars in a very engaged and I think effective way. The troops at ISI have become very much the new PC busters, a high-tech modern army led by that Confederate soldier T. Kenneth Cribb. What has been particularly gratifying is the way in which ISI sponsors lectures on hundreds of campuses every year. And I do not exaggerate when I say that for many students, this is their only exposure in the entire academic season to an alternative point of view, a point of view that cannot be embraced or digested if it is not heard. To this end, ISI and similar groups are performing a very vital service. Secondly, and very importantly, ISI has ventured into the new territory and the somewhat uncharted territory of mobilizing alumni and trustees to try to exercise their undoubted and powerful leverage to help to bring about reform. I remember what a Yale football coach once said about his attitude toward the alumni. It was to keep them sullen but not mutinous. And this very accurately reflects the attitude of most college administrations. They want to keep their alumni only involved insofar as they can make contributions. And ISI has been doing very effective work in trying to bring alumni from different schools together and develop practical strategies for bringing about actual change. Third, a project that I have been involved in, which has been to try to evangelize, if you will, to secondary schools and to prep schools and to young people who have not yet run into Mr. Stanley Fish. So that ISI has been reaching out at their lower levels, recognizing that even at the high school level, even at the elementary school level, political correctness appears to be a kind of new form of child abuse to which ISI is trying to provide some kind of an antidote. In conclusion, let me note that on our campuses we have a new generation of faculty, many of whose politics were shaped in the late 1960s. These are professors who are very determined, often very ideologically resolute, sometimes educated beyond their intelligence, but nevertheless, many of them have PhDs, many of them have tenure, and they are not going anywhere. What can be done about them? I'm afraid that there is an element of pessimism. Sometimes I say that our only hope lies in the actuarial tables. But in the short and medium term, ISI is doing, I think, very good work to keep these activists and these Philistines in check. ISI does comprise a kind of guerrilla army, but it's a different kind of army, armed not only with indignation, but really armed with a legacy of thought, a legacy of ideas, a legacy that goes back and extends from Homer to the present. I think we have, on this 40th anniversary, a reason for optimism and reason for celebration, because whatever our difficulties, whatever our sieges, whatever the challenges we face, our position has many determined and resolute activists, the forces of ISI on its side, and in addition our position has, as Richard Nixon used to say, the added merit of being true. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Many of you here tonight have been profoundly affected by our cleanup batter, whether as acting as a kind of guru to conservative activists in the 60s, influencing countless numbers through his articles and his many books in the 70s, or educating now for over a decade aspiring journalists in the principles necessary for society to exist in freedom. Stan Evans has been one of the most brilliant and dependable sons of the conservative movement. I think for many of us, it Stan's unfailing commitment to the education and advancement of young conservatives that has over the years endeared him. I was with him when he was down at Washington and Lee one time. He had spoken to the student body, and we were driving back to the airport. The student driver said, "Mr. Evans, I certainly enjoyed your speech last night, but I was concerned that you didn't mention the environment. Aren't you at all concerned about the environment?" Stan says, "Of course I'm concerned about the environment. Think about it. It's everywhere." He says, he said, "In Indiana, we've taken steps to push it back. We've paved the entire state." I was also present when Stan issued his famous critique of the Nixon administration. And Stan said that he only disagreed with Richard Nixon on two things: his foreign policy and his domestic policy. Stan was certainly one of the central figures in forging our earlier conservative consensus. Did you know he actually dictated the Sharon Statement at the famous conference at Bill Buckley's estate, which founded Young Americans for Freedom? Did you further know that he dictated it to Annette Kirk? All sorts of secrets revealed tonight. Well, having played such a key role over the years, a role that you're very familiar with, I can think of no better person to point the way out of our current dilemmas and speak to the question of the next 40 years of American conservatism than ISI's longtime trustee, mentor to many thousands, and friend to so many of us in this room, M. Stanton Evans.
Thank you very much. The hour is a bit late, and as Henry VIII said to one of his wives, I won't keep you long. I feel a bit reticent coming here with all of the academic folks and people like Bill Buckley and Dinesh D'Souza. I am a humble journalist, albeit a conservative journalist, which is a kind of oxymoron. It's like jumbo shrimp or rap music, or my favorite, Senate Ethics Committee. Now, I realize, and I said something like this at the Philadelphia Society meeting 2 weeks ago, that at so genteel and cerebral a gathering, it would be not only inappropriate, but perhaps offensive to tell tawdry political jokes to get cheap laughs. So I will tell only a few. In fact, I'll just tell one. This one, the premise of this joke, which I think you'll like, is that Howard Metzenbaum and Joe Biden and Teddy Kennedy all die and go to hell. Now, mind you, and that's just the premise. Now, they're all taken down to the lowest circle, and they're led to a series of dungeons, and they open the door to the first dungeon, and they take Howard Metzenbaum there, and in the dungeon are every kind of loathsome reptile, cobras, pythons, rattlesnakes, whatever, all writhing in loathsome fashion, and a voice of doom says, which one did I name, Howard Metzenbaum or Joe Biden? Howard Metzenbaum, you have sinned. You will spend eternity in this chamber. And they throw him in and slam the door shut. They take Joe Biden to the next chamber, open the door, and it's full of tarantulas and scorpions and centipedes and spiders and other horrible insects. And the voice of doom says, Joe Biden, you have sinned. You will spend eternity in this chamber. They throw him in and slam the door shut. They take Teddy Kennedy to the third chamber. They open the door, and there's nothing in there but Bo Derek in a flimsy negligee. And the voice says, Bo Derek, you have sinned. Cheap, tawdry. All right. Listening to Bill Buckley's very articulate, as always, eloquent discussion of the growth of conservatism, and then listening to Dinesh D'Souza's very accurate description of the present situation on the campuses, I wanted to cry out with Job, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Because the situation that is on the campuses today remains a very, very serious problem, as Dinesh has so well documented. And the political situation that we confront here is not unrelated to that situation on the campus. And we are here to celebrate victories and successes, but if we think about where we are, we also have to realize we have very, very serious problems. The political and intellectual difficulties we confront are interconnected in many ways, but most obviously because they derive from a common source. Richard Weaver once told us, and we have repeated it many times, that ideas have consequences. But the absence of ideas has consequences as well. And we see this both politically and intellectually in our culture today. We've seen it politically here, even in the Reagan and Bush years, as people tended to forget, I think, with understandable reasons, the ideas that had brought them here to begin with. I'm not talking simply about those whose idea of serving conservatism was simply to get a job in the administration, which was needed. We needed people in the administration, in both administrations. There were some people that, as we say here, went native, and the expression that I once heard used was that there were conservatives who came to Washington with Reagan who thought that big government was a cesspool, and after they'd been here 8 years, it felt more like a hot tub. And that was a problem to some degree, but beyond that was the problem of simply getting our priorities reversed, forgetting that the intellectual task is primary, the political task is secondary. And I think that one of the things that happened to us over the course of the last decade, understandably again, was that we poured so many resources into politics, into elections, into lobbying, into doing all the things that must be done here in Washington, that we got away from the basic ideas that brought us here to begin with. That is the bad news, and the campus situation is bad as well for very similar reasons. As I also remarked at the Philadelphia Society, there is some good news, and we need to look at that also. As Mark Twain once said about Wagner's music, it's not as bad as it sounds. There are many resources and many tendencies within the intellectual world and within the political world that are working in our favor. The best news of all, it seems to me, is to remember that neither the campus nor Washington, D.C. is America, that these institutions in the city and the institutions in the academic world are basically captive to an intellectual elite which has mastered the techniques of engineering institutions. And we have, therefore, two nations almost confronting each other in our political and intellectual debates today. We have the nation of America outside of these institutions. We have a verbalizing class which controls these institutions for reasons that we cannot explore this evening. What ISI is about, and has been about for all these years, is to create a new verbalizing class which is supportive of, rather than contemptuous of, the traditional values of the average American. This has been ISI's task from the beginning. It is its task today. It will be its task in the future. In performing this task, it seems to me that all of us who are part of the conservative movement must remember where we came from. We must get back to basics. One of the things that I tell students at our journalism program and at a school where I teach journalism is that the most important thing about any story you cover is you. And I don't mean this in some feel-good sense, but in the sense that when you go to cover a story, when you're dealing with issues in the news, the conceptual apparatus that you use to report that story is what allows you to understand it and get the accurate report back to your audience. If you don't have that preparation, then you can't do your job. And it seems to me that this is relevant in a wider sense as well. We are told in the Book of Kings to put our own house in order, and I think that is probably the foremost task that we can perform. We cannot control what other people do. We cannot control many other elements in our society. We cannot control people in government or in the academy, but we can control what we do. And it is important that we concentrate on doing what we can do correctly and can do effectively to continue the record of progress that ISI has established. That means many things. It means that we must do our homework. We must do our homework not only in the sense of studying the issues of the day, but we must approach the fundamental issues that ISI has always addressed from its inception back in 1953. We must know our theology, our philosophy, our history, our economics, our literature, and most of all, we must grasp the fact that our free institutions stem from our religious faith, that these are not incompatible, but mutually supportive. This does not mean in addressing these issues we should forget politics. We can't. It does mean that if we get these things right, if we get the basics right, then the details will become right as well. Something like this was done back in the early 60s when ISI and the Philadelphia Society and others established a larger unity and coherence for conservatism, and by doing that laid the predicate for its political successes that began in the 1960s. Laying that predicate was important, but it was not the most important thing about that endeavor. That endeavor was important because it was intrinsically important, because it is important for us to know the truth of our condition. And that is what ISI has tried to convey throughout its history. John Adams wrote a letter in 1780 to his wife, Abigail Adams. I won't quote the whole thing to you, but just to paraphrase, in which he said that it is my duty to study politics and government and diplomacy so that my sons may study mathematics and philosophy, so that their children can study poetry and the fine arts. It seems to me that we need a similar perspective. We must do something like that, but in a different sequence. We must study and encourage others to study the truths of our religion, the culture of the West, the history and institutions of our country, so that we may preserve the liberties that Adams and the other founders passed on to us, and then pass them on in turn to all the generations that are to follow. Such has been the mission of ISI for 40 years. Such will be its mission, and that of many other organizations represented in this room, for the 40 years and more that are to come. We have suffered our setbacks, won our victories, done things that many believed and others hoped would be impossible. In the decades ahead, I know the young people of ISI will do the same, but more so. The best, as Browning said, in only a slightly different context, is yet to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Dinesh. Thank you, Bill. You lived up to our very high expectations. I want to thank once again our founding families and their representatives for making a special point of being with us to commemorate our 40th birthday, and all of our more recent allies, as recent as 35, 30 years ago, for being with us. You were good to come. Thank you and good night to you all. You can come up to 810 and have a drink. Should see if Bill wants to come. I'll ask the phone. He's staying here, I think.
You have your stuff in the
The Intercollegiate Studies Institute has more than 50,000 student and faculty members. The group describes its purpose as advancing a traditional liberal arts education and combating socialist and collective thinking on the nation's college and university campuses. Tomorrow, C-SPAN 2 brings you the C-SPAN Classroom. Every Sunday, we show you a short video about the U.S. government that educators use as a teaching resource. C-SPAN Classroom, tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time on C-SPAN 2.
C-SPAN 2, like its companion network C-SPAN, is funded entirely by America's cable television companies as a public service.
Now here is a look at the schedule ahead on C-SPAN 2. All times are Eastern. Next, we're going to show you a news conference held to talk about a movement led by Congressman John Kasich of Ohio to allow House lawmakers to cast votes by phone in certain circumstances. Then at 12:40 p.m., Robert Bork is among the speakers at a discussion on conservatism and the Supreme Court of the United States. At 2:30, the Institute for International Economics hosts a forum discussing the North American Free Trade Agreement and its impact on jobs, migration, and agriculture. And that's a look at some highlights ahead on C-SPAN 2 today. Now, for the next 40 minutes, we're going to show you a news conference held on Thursday by Congressman John Kasich and others members of the House of Representatives to cast their votes by telephone. Currently, members vote by inserting an electronic voting card into a machine on the House floor, and they must be present on the House floor in order to vote.
I know, Pat. I mean, we should have done this by teleconferencing.
We'd have been here quick. We didn't have the bridge come.
That's right. Well, we're going to get started because we have the main folks here. And everybody can just sit, and what we can do is I'm going to try to move everybody through so everybody has a chance to participate. I want to thank my colleagues who are here, and I think everyone's going to notice that as the different members file in, this will be one of the most